Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. I am already recording to the cloud. Today we are covering regulatory compliance, and there's a lot of information. I'm going to go over it at a fairly high level, but what I've given you are a lot of resources where you can go and do some digging on your own. One thing I do want to share real quickly is, at least here at Colorado State University, our compliance office, RCRO, this is their website. So they go on their website, you can go into any of these areas that we're going to talk about today: Institutional Review Board, Institutional Animal Care and Use Committee, Biosafety, RCR, conflict of interest. These three areas you don't need to know, but all of these other areas, you can go into any single one of these and you can click on training, and a lot of times the training is going to take you to these city modules, this Access CITI training. Or you can go through and read the federal regs around all of these different areas, or you can read some of the resources and facts that are out there. That's a good way to kind of get an overview, is to go to your compliance website. Again, folks at CSU, you would go to the RCRO, the research.coloradostate.edu/RCRO. And you can just kind of peek around on their site and really get a wealth of information. Jeff Ritchie, when I was talking with him after he did his half-day overview for us, said if you did the city training, you'll get everything you need to know. The problem with the city training, if your institution, first of all, your institution should subscribe to the different city training modules. If not, then you won't have access. If you went to the city training, you can log in through your organization. The problem is it's not just going to pull up city training for IRB, city training for conflict of interest. Instead, you're going to have to say, like, I'm an investigator and this is the kind of research I do, and then the system's going to determine what type of training you need. So you'd have to be really broad, because I've tried to go in and do the city training and it was just a little cumbersome. But know that that is one area that you could use for your, sorry, let me pull this down, for getting more information on conflict of interest. So having said that, let me now share my slides with you. Okay, share and okay. So what we are going to talk about today, and again, it's going to be a lot of information, so I kind of apologize in advance about that. We are going to talk about the regulatory compliance areas that you will see on the exam. Okay, so really it boils down to, I always think of regulatory compliance as boiling down to all of those areas that you learned about in kindergarten, right? That we shouldn't steal from each other. In other words, we shouldn't plagiarize, we shouldn't lie, we shouldn't falsify things. A lot of that stuff's under the responsible conduct of research. It's about, not doing harm to other people. It's about not harming animals. Some of those basics. So most everything we do in research administration is compliance, right? Compliance with government and agency and institutional rules and regulations. The areas under regulatory compliance that we're going to deal with have some additional regulations around them. And these are areas such as doing research with humans, doing research with animals, doing research with biological hazardous materials. Also for our trainees, what type of information do we need to impart to our trainees on doing responsible conduct of research? So that's what we're going to go through today, including the regulations that you'll need to know and some of the information you would need to know for the exam. Some of the slides I'm not really going to read through or touch on. I'm just going to say, hey, it's there for you, so you have that and you can go and do a little bit more deeper dig on it. So let's start right in then with human participants. So, and it's so weird because, I don't see a lot of I saw some faces when you all came on, but I just see a lot of names. I assume there are people on there. Again, if you have a question or a comment, pop off of the mute and put in your comment or utilize the chat feature. So before we get into human subjects, I want to invite you all to participate in a study that I'm conducting. Okay, I want you to understand that your participation is completely voluntary. And as an incentive, I am willing to pay your CRA examination fee, which is quite hefty, if you complete my entire study. So the study involves assessing the effects of omega-3 and vitamin D on neuronal myelination. Does that sound okay to you? Is that something you all would agree to participate in? Now remember, it's a voluntary decision, but you have to complete my entire study in order for me to pay your CRA registration fee. So what are your thoughts on that? Particularly after reading the Belmont report, what might be some issues? Carmen, I saw your hand was raised. Go ahead. Okay, maybe your hand wasn't raised.
No, I'm sorry. I meant
okay.
to say I'm in.
Okay. What kind of, what questions are being raised for you here on this study? I'll go on to say that you're going to have to take about 1,200 milligrams of omega-3 every day, plus some vitamin D, okay? And I'm going to do some blood draws periodically throughout the study. You're also going to have to go under MRI for me. And again, this study's going to probably take about at least 6 weeks, if not longer. But if you stick through it with me, I'll pay that CRA registration for you. What questions do you have? What concerns do you have? What's bubbling up for you? Does everybody know what neuronal myelination is? Sylvia, no? No? No. Kara, no. Okay. Is this a problem? Does it matter if you don't know what this is? Have I not explained this well enough? People are unwilling to talk today. Let's see. Will there be harm to the participants? I don't know. This is research, so there could be some potential, I don't know really how omega-3 and the dosage I'm going to give you that combined with the vitamin D, if there would be potential side effects. That's something that we would be learning in the study. Okay. Michael needs more information. What else is bubbling up for you all? Okay. Well, we'll come unable to continue. Why would they not get paid? Well, because part of my study is that you have to complete the whole thing. I want to make sure I don't have anybody drop out because I don't want to put this big incentive out there and have you all drop out. Has anyone taken it before? What are the risks and benefits? How are the subjects being selected? I'm just going to use research administrators because I think it's a really easy population, and particularly if I can dangle that carrot of the CRA exam fee in front of you. Your cheap labor, because you're cheap labor. Yeah, I think that's a great reason to choose you as study participants. Okay, participants have to be able to drop out at any time. Yeah, but in this case, I really need you to stick through it. So therefore, I'm going to tie that incentive to you sticking through it, right? Privacy concerns. Okay, yeah, I'm not going to share your information with anybody. You just kind of have to trust me on that. Can MRI be done local to the participant? Yeah, we don't have an MRI here at CSU, so you're going to have to travel to Denver Health to be able to do the MRI. So, good questions, really good questions. So, neuronal myelination. So, my background, actually, before I got into research administration, was physiological and brain studies and looking at myelination and actually visual system development. So, this is where my interest comes from. So, okay, so we're going to talk about my proposed study. Oh, nice. I'm sounding sleazy and untrustworthy. Well, Okay, so those are all really good points. And so we're going to talk about my study as we go through some of the basic principles of human subject research. So I'm glad I'm so trustworthy. I do not sound too confident. Oh, come on, I know all about neuronal myelination. Okay. Okay, so moving on, let's get a little bit of the historical perspective. So it started with the National Research Act of 1974. This was signed into law into 1974 by President Richard Nixon. Talk about trustworthy, come on. But really what happened was there were a series of congressional hearings on human subjects research. And this all came about because of a number of things that were happening at the time. One that you might have heard about before were the Tuskegee syphilis study. So in this study, African-American males with syphilis were lied to and denied treatment for more than 40 years. They were part of this study. As a result of this study, a number of these subjects died. They also infected others with the disease, and they also passed on a form of congenital syphilis to their children. And there was a lot of outcry in the public. At the time, congressional hearings were held, and because of that, the National Research Act was signed into law. What did that act do? What it did is it created the next bullet that you see, the National Commission for the Protection of Human Subjects of Biomedical and Behavioral Research. So that's the important thing to know. That act then created that commission, and that commission was told to identify the basic ethical principles that should be underlying the conduct of biomedical and behavioral research that involves human participants. Okay. And as a result of that, that commission came together and they came up with what we know today as the Belmont report. And hopefully you all got a chance to read that Belmont report. Like I said, it was just kind of a nice, tidy little read, which is why I had assigned it for our homework. So the Belmont report was published in the Federal Register, that daily journal, right, in 1979. So it's been around for a while. Okay. And I think I'd already mentioned to you prior that the Belmont report was actually named not after a person, but after the place. So which is shown there. Oops, if I can get my slides to forward. On the next slide. So it was that National Commission that wrote the Belmont report. It was published in the Federal Register, and here it outlines the ethical principles and guidelines for the protection of human subjects research. So the report itself really just started, again, with some conversations and then that congressional mandate. And we're going to go through some of the important parts of that report here in the next few slides. Okay, so the guiding principles. The Belmont report begins by making a distinction between practice and research. So practice being interventions designed to enhance patient well-being, and then research, which is designed to test a hypothesis. Then it goes on to address three basic guiding principles or ethical principles, and ends with a nice little discussion on how to apply those principles. So the principles are here. There you go: respect for persons, beneficence, and justice. So with respect for persons, whoops, sorry, I thought I had more on that slide. With respect for persons, we're talking about individuals being treated as autonomous, capable individuals of making their own choices, their informed consent. So they have to be given enough information to make an informed decision on whether they want to participate in a study. It sounds like with my myelination study, a few people wrote that they needed more information. They needed to understand what was being done to them. They needed to understand what neuronal myelination was, right? So it sounds like you all weren't given enough information to make informed consent. Well, one thing that the Belmont principles laid out was that subject participants must be given enough information in layman terms so that they can make an informed decision on whether they are willing to participate. And that participation should be completely voluntary participation. And they should be able to drop out at any time. So something Sylvia was saying, we should be able to drop out and still get paid. Absolutely, right? The other thing to consider there is that that subjects and that participation isn't being kind of like swayed by too much incentive, right? The amount of incentive I offered was pretty high because the cost of the exam is not cheap. So a human subject review board might look at that and say, okay, you're offering, you know, too much incentive, and some people might not be able to say no, given that level of incentive. So those are the kind of things we're looking at when we're talking about respect for persons. And really the idea of informed consent falls under this basic principle, that they have to have enough information to be able to make an informed decision on whether they should participate or not. Okay. Beneficence is looking at that the risk-benefit ratio. And I think Michael or somebody else chimed in about that. Like, what is the risk here versus what are the benefits? And I said, well, I don't know what they are. An investigator should be able to tell you exactly what risk you're going to undergo. So, and this would be a pretty risky study if I'm giving you certain amounts of vitamins. Also, it could be a risk to somebody just drawing blood in and of itself. Just talking about drawing blood is a risk for some people for passing out, right? So looking at that risk-benefit ratio, are you going to benefit more than the risk? What can we do then to reduce those risks and increase the benefits? So those are things, again, that IRB, institutional review boards, are looking at, is that risk-benefit ratio, and do the subjects completely comprehend all of the risk to them. Okay. And then finally, justice. Justice is, we're talking about equality, or more like equitability, on who's receiving the benefits, how we can ensure benefit and risk is evenly distributed in the population. So, for example, we shouldn't experiment on a prison population and then not offer any benefits to that prison population. The Tuskegee syphilis study was another example. These African-American males were being researched for years and years and years, and even when a cure was found, they were not offered the cure. Okay, that is not just. So the research has to involve informed consent, beneficence, looking at the risk-benefit ratio, and equitability in terms of distributing any risk or any benefits. Okay. I have a really good video on this. It's an older video. I will share it after this if you all would like to view it, because it really goes through these areas and talks about each one of those areas. So I will, you know, share that with you. So my proposed study didn't seem to hit all of the areas that were outlined in the Belmont report, right? You all were not given enough information. The incentive might have been seen as too large, and I really didn't even talk at all about any of the risk or the benefits. So probably not one that's going to pass any kind of institutional review board. So there was an issue of volunteering, right? Again, you weren't giving information, and there might have been some undue influence there with my large incentive. Okay. There could be a potential issue with comprehension. I didn't explain to you even what neuronal myelination is, right? That's actually, you know, the myelination helps neurons, which are your brain cells, right, conduct messages and send those messages rapidly. If you don't have myelination, you don't have that rapid conduction. So there are some autoimmune disorders such as multiple sclerosis, which actually affect the myelination around the cell and therefore impede or reduce that communication between those brain cells. I didn't explain any of that to you. That would need to be explained in this type of study. Okay. Issues with inequitable risk and benefit. And then any other issues, and I think you all came up with a lot of them, even to the point of calling the researcher sleazy. So, okay. So yeah, that one probably is not going to pass muster. So some of the research involving human subjects. This definition is taken right out of 45 CFR 46, which is also known as the Common Rule. Again, if you attended Jeff's session or had a chance to attend it later, you might recall that he said it's called the Common Rule because all the federal awarding agencies agree to this regulation. So this definition is taken right from the Common Rule, the definition for research and for human subjects. So with research, it's that systematic investigation that contributes to generalizable knowledge. That's what we're talking about here. Okay. And then with human subjects, it's defined as living individual about whom an investigator obtains data or other identifiable private information. So generalizable knowledge is information where the intended findings can be applied to populations and situations beyond those that are being investigated, right? If I was just looking at doing my myelination study with research administrators, I would say I could take that information and generalize beyond non-research administrators, okay? Okay, and then taking data, obtaining data. The data could be directly taken, such as I'm going to take your blood and the blood samples, or it could be indirect. It could be that I'm reviewing your medical records or I'm reviewing your academic records. So that data doesn't have to necessarily be taking something physical. It could be a record review of your information as well. So again, this definition you should be familiar with, and it comes right out of the Common Rule, which is 45 CFR 46. And the other thing, as I'm giving you these references, most of the time, I think I've already said this, the CFR references, you're not going to be quizzed on those references. The two I would definitely know are 2 CFR 200, which is Uniform Guidance, and 45 CFR 46, which is the Common Rule. Other than that, in Jeff's words, it's not trivial pursuit on the exam, right? And I did ask him about dates, and he said, use dates again. He said, it's not trivial pursuit. So while I'm giving you some dates, it's more for historical context rather than I have to absolutely memorize this date. But I would definitely know at least those 2 CFR references. Okay, so the Human Subjects Regulatory Framework. If you remember from last Monday, we talked about different regulatory agencies. So once we have a law, remember there's an appropriate regulatory agency that has to come in and create the regulations and guidance for implementing the law. So what I'm showing you here are the regulatory agents for human subjects. So first one on the slide there is the Office of Human Research Protection, or OHARP. Okay, and then the other is the Food and Drug Administration. Again, I only have given you the CFR references, so that way if you want to go and actually read, if you go to that online CFR, you can put in the title and the reference and pull those right up and read all of this information for yourself. So with OHARP is typically concerned with the protection of human subjects in biomedical research and biomedicine, where Food and Drug Administration is primarily concerned with clinical trials. So OHARP is really a leader in the protection of human rights and human welfare and well-being of human subjects, again with that research that's conducted by like DHHS agencies. It provides all the regulatory education and oversight, and this is actually, it's out of OHARP where we actually get our federal-wide assurance number as well. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in upcoming slides. So FDA is really focused on clinical trial investigations, such as the testing of new drugs or testing of medical devices. So it also includes some clinical testing on food products like infant formula, say. And also when somebody comes out with a food or maybe a drug and they make all of these claims, some nutritional claims. If you have this food, then it's going to do this for you. That type of research is overseen by the FDA. So they're both similar in that they describe some of the regulations and circumstances around the oversight and review of human protections research. It kind of just depends on what realm. So when you're going through the exam, think of OHARP being more biomedical research and Food and Drug Administration being more testing of drug and medical devices, and you'll be good. Oh, okay, and I already mentioned federal-wide assurance. We get that, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a minute. We get our federal-wide assurance number from OHARP. Also, the requirements for our institutional review boards and membership and review, and our informed consent requirements. All of this comes down from these regulatory agencies, and we'll talk a little bit more about those. Okay. Ooh, lots of stuff there, sorry. We're going to talk about all these here on the next slide. Okay. So the federal-wide assurance, if you're somebody pre-award and you're used to having to fill out your federal-wide assurance number on, this was before things were pre-populated, you actually had to type in the number, right? That number provides a commitment to the Department of Health and Human Services that as an institution, you're complying with the federal regulations. Okay. That federal-wide assurance number is effective for 5 years. So that's something that an institution gets. This is not your investigator's number for their protocol where they've gone internal review and they get a protocol number. This is your institution's registration saying we comply with, as an institution, as CSU, we're going to comply with all these federal regulations on the makeup of our IRB, on the training of folks who are conducting human subjects research. So that's often confused by investigators where they'll try to put their protocol number in or their approval numbers. That's not what we're looking for here. We're looking for that institutional registration number. Again, it's effective for 5 years and it has to be renewed every 5 years. And so you'll have somebody at your institution that's responsible for doing that. In addition to receiving that federal-wide assurance number, IRBs must register with OHARP. Again, this is separate. So the IRB itself has to be registered with OHARP, and that IRB registration is effective for 3 years, and it has to be renewed every 3 years. So 2 things to remember on here: federal-wide assurance number every 5 years, the IRB registration every 3 years. Okay. What are the IRB committee requirements? Each IRB has to have no fewer than, so at least 5 members with varying backgrounds. That way they can have a very complete and thorough review of the research activities that are commonly conducted at your institution. There has to be sufficient scientific qualification and expertise for the type of research being done at your institution. And there really should be a mix of gender and race and cultural diversity on your board as well. So no fewer than 5 people. At least one has to have a primary interest in a scientific area, one in a non-scientific area. There should be at least one individual not affiliated with your institution or an immediate family member or somebody affiliated with the institution. So no conflict of interest there, because you need that outside person to be impartial. You don't want somebody who's like an alumni of your institution and a donor of your institution on that board, because they might be thinking, well, you know, if I don't let this protocol, if I don't approve for this protocol, and particularly if it's tied to research funding, then they're not going to get their research funding. So you want to have that separation and that transparency. And I already mentioned this other one in the other slide, that the institution must register their IRB with OHARP. Okay. What type of education or training requirements are out there? It really could be agency specific and institution specific. So a lot of institutions will have blanket requirements for human subjects research, whether it's being funded by a funding agency or not. So if somebody is engaging in research, then they have to go through and get IRB approval. The other thing Jeff talked about was the misfortune of the term exempt. Sometimes research is exempt from review, but it is up to our institutional review board to determine if the research is exempt or not. exempt from that review. It is not up to the investigator to make that determination. So just know that this information can vary. It could be that you're applying to a specific program or agency which has specific requirements. Your institution may have more stringent requirements as well. The one takeaway on this slide I would say is if your institution has a federal-wide assurance number, their OHARP basically says that the institution is responsible for ensuring that any investigator conducting human subjects research is trained, okay, in accordance with regulations for the protection of human subjects. It doesn't say you have to use city training. It doesn't dictate what the training is, how often the training has to occur. Just basically to get that federal-wide assurance number, our institution has to say, we provide some kind of training. Okay. Here at CSU, that training is through the city modules and some in-person training that's done by our compliance office. Okay. Any questions there? Okay. So I mentioned city, that's the acronym for city. You might want to be familiar with that because city has a lot of training out there on different regulatory compliance areas, and it could be something that you would see on the exam. So CITI, Collaborative Institutional Training Initiative, is what that stands for. Okay. And again, it's not just IRB, it's also IACUC training, it's conflict of interest training, it is responsible conduct of research training, it's training, you know, for biosafety. So there's a lot of different modules that are offered by CITI. Okay, Primer I just mentioned. Primer is just another place you can go in association to learn more. And this is actually a lot of folks in the compliance office typically are members of Primer. This is public responsibility in medicine and research. This organization provides professional development in areas of regulatory compliance and ethics. So if you want to learn more about regulatory compliance in general, you can go to Primer and look at some of their information on their website. Okay, additional human subjects considerations. One single IRB. This applies to projects that involve multiple institutions. Typically institutions located within the US that are engaged in collaborative or cooperative type of research, they have to have a single IRB for the portion of the research that's conducted in the US. And there's a lot of good information out on NIH's website on the single IRB policy. So you can go out and read a little bit more about that. HIPAA, I don't remember why I put this in red, so I apologize for that. If you've gone to the doctor anytime since like mid-90s, you've signed some kind of HIPAA compliance, right? This was actually signed by President Bill Clinton in 1996. What is the importance for human subjects research here? The importance for human subject research is that HIPAA requires protection of information. It requires confidential handling of protected health information for individuals. So it really limits the use and disclosure of that public health information, or PHI. You might have heard that acronym before, Public Health Information, PHI. So it's this written authorization for researchers to access patient records. Remember, sometimes I said that data might not be physical data like blood or hair samples, but it could be patient, access to patient records. And it's how then the investigator accesses those records and how they maintain confidentiality and anonymity around the research, and particularly anything that could identify a person that's in those records. So that's why HIPAA is important to human subjects. A couple others that you might see on the exam, the Data and Safety Monitoring Board. So this board is actually a group of independent people, clinical researchers, statisticians, physicians. It's basically a patient advocate board. It's those folks who monitor the progress of a clinical trial, and they look for how effective the trial is, how safe it is. They can actually, this board can step in and say, we're stopping this research right now. They also might say, okay, you're coming up on some really good benefits that the people who are enrolled in your clinical trial need to be made aware of and have access to. So they could stop a trial for being effective, meaning there are clear benefits. Let's start giving the patients this is whatever the treatment is, or if it's ineffective and they're seeing a lot of adverse effects from the clinical trial. So it's a board that needs to be established when engaging in clinical research. Okay, as opposed to a data safety monitoring plan. The plan differs from the board in that the plan is developed by the PI and it is reviewed by the Institutional Review Board, or IRB. The plan outlines how the study progress is going to be monitored, and how the investigator plans to ensure the safety of the subjects and the confidentiality of their data. So the plan is written by the PI, approved by the IRB, and the board is that outside advocate group that will, once the research is being conducted, once the study is being conducted, they will step in and provide some of that monitoring. Okay. And there can be actually a cost to having a board. And so that might be a pre-award cost that you all put into, particularly institutions that do a lot of clinical trials that they include in their budgets. This is just the acronym I already told you, the public health information. Maybe that's why I had HIPAA in red. I don't remember. I was looking through my slides and I'm like, I don't know why I put that in red. Okay. And then this is just a definition of a clinical trial. Research performed in people aimed at evaluating a medical, surgical, or behavioral intervention. Okay. And you can find this definition under DHHS. If you just Google DHHS clinical trial, you can pull that up. Okay. Oh, so wow, that was a lot. And the interesting thing is there's a lot more even on animal welfare. So before we move on to animal welfare, are there any questions on clinical trials? No, I'm sorry, human subjects. Wow, I'm still stuck on clinical trials. Clinical trials and or human subjects or IRB or regulation or any of it. Okay, well, if not, we will move on to animal welfare then. So we're talking here about research involving animal subjects, okay? So the interesting thing here is the guidance applies to not only research, but also teaching and demonstration, having pets, testing animals. So to have Cam the Ram on campus, right? We would have to go through getting approval through our IACUC, IACUC, Institutional Animal Care and Use Committee, because it's not just on doing the research on the animals, it's on how do we acquire the animals, where are we housing them, what kind of stimulation are we giving the animals, how are we feeding and watering them and caring for them, you know, are we going to have field trips where kids are coming through touching the animals. So it's all on how we care for the animals and not just the research that we're conducting on the animals. You know, we typically are not addressing care for humans when we're talking about IRB, but when we're talking about IACUC, we're looking at all of it. So know that the definition is more broad here for animals. It applies to the research, teaching, or demonstration and testing. So, and as I have here, it goes into, again, how do we acquire the animals? How are we transporting them? How do we house them? When I was a graduate student, I did research in visual system development on the tree shrew, which is from Southeast Asia area, from Malaysia. And it's actually illegal to import tree shrews, at least at that time, into the US. So we actually had a colony here that we hand reared. So because they're considered mammals, we would have different agencies come in and look at how we're housing these animals. And basically with primate care, primate and mammal care, there are certain levels of stimulation that you would have to give. So say you had primates, you might incorporate toys into their areas so that way they can play and socialize. So it was interesting because we had a board come in and do a review and say we basically had to put toys in the cages with our tree shrews, which if anybody knew anything about the tree shrew, they would know that that would have totally wigged them out. There's also cleaning regulations for the cages, how often they have to be cleaned. Again, they're looking at a primate saying this is how often you should clean the cage. They were trying to apply that to our tree shrews. Tree shrews rely very heavily on scent and scent marking, and they scent mark the crap out of everything. If we had gone in every week and cleaned their cages, they would have probably died from stress. So it's really kind of interesting that we're not just talking about the research conducted on them. Of course, that's important as well, but it's the whole package on how we get them, how we rear them, how we house them, what type of stimulation we might be providing to the animals, depending upon the animal's classification. So, and what animals are covered by the regulation really depends upon the particular law and agency guidance, which we're going to go into all those different laws and guidance here in just a second. Okay, a lot of stuff there. Am I sounding more confident now? Okay, let's go on then with Animal Subject Regulatory Framework. Again, we have two regulatory framework here that we're going to talk about. Animal Welfare Act back in 1966. It's been amended like at least 10 times, at least 8 or 9 times since it was enacted. It was basically passed by Congress to regulate the humane care of laboratory animals. Okay, it was passed in response to a bunch of lobbying that was going on at the time. There were public allegations at the time that people's pets were being pet-napped and sold to research laboratories for use in research. I'm not saying that's true or not. I don't know if that was going on, but that was a public outcry. So that's why this law came into being. So people were assured that their pets were not being stolen, off the street and then used in research. So the law covers treatment of animals that are intended for research, okay, and bred for research and for this, also bred for commercial sale. And so again, we're talking a lot about the breeding and the transportation. Remember I said how we acquire the animals there. So the law really addresses quite a number of things there. Animal Welfare Act is administered by the USDA's Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service, or APHIS, APHIS, Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service. The Animal Welfare Act is the only U.S. federal law that's regulated, that regulates the treatment, of animals in research and animals for transport, for exhibition, all of those things. What else do I want to say on here? I think that's it on USDA. So we'll move on then to the Health Research Extension Act, which builds upon the Animal Welfare Act. So Health Research Extension Act, 1985. Actually, it was first published in 63, but then it was amended in 1985. Again, you're not going to be quizzed on the date, so I shouldn't get hung up there. But just know that it really builds on a lot of the information from the Animal Welfare Act, but it specifically targets biomedical and behavioral research. So it sets the guidelines for the care and use of animals in that type of funded research. Okay, it's also the Health Research Extension Act, which defines the establishment of the IACUC, Institutional Animal Care and Use Committee, and provides some of the assurances, which again, we're going to go in on the next slide here. OLAW makes the Health Research Extension Act known to the public through Public Health Service Policy. That's why OLAW is mentioned there. So, and OLAW is actually part of the NIH. So NIH OLAW, or Office of Laboratory Animal Welfare. So it's here that you can find all the PHHS policy on humane care and use of laboratory animals. Okay, and also the steps for getting the animal welfare assurance number. Again, that number you put on the cover page of an application, not a protocol approval number, but the institution's animal welfare assurance number to show that your institution is in compliance with OLAW. That comes out of this NIH OLAW office. Okay. I think that's all I want to say on that because that's probably enough. It's a lot. So basic regulatory requirements, you have to have that, your institution has to have that animal welfare assurance number. Okay. Also, the research being conducted with, or even demonstration teaching with the use of animals should go under review by an institutional animal care and use committee. It might be called something different at your institution. These are just the terminologies that are used. You know, that are typically used. I've seen some IRBs called different things, some IACUCs called different things. Okay, so also there's very specific information that's required in the applications in order to get PHS funding, such as the number of animals to be used, the type of animals, the classification of animals, a justification on why you're using that type of animal, why you're using the number of animals that you've proposed. Could you use less? Could you actually use a different animal model? Did you have to use a primate, or could you use a rat or a rabbit? Could you do a computer simulation? So back in the day when I was an undergrad, you know, we did a lot of research with frogs and piffing frogs and looking at the nervous system. A lot of that research has changed, and now in schools they do computer simulations rather than actually using frogs. So could a computer simulation substitute? If not, why not? What's the justification for that? So that kind of information has to be in place. So when I did my research with tree shrews, I had to justify why the tree shrew. I was doing temporal vision research, which is detecting a flicker. So movement research, basically, tree shrews are really super susceptible to any type of movement out there, right? Because that's how they survive in the environment, to know that, you know, if an owl's swooping down to get them, they can see that movement and get away. So I had to justify why I was using that animal and how many animals I was using in my research. So all of that information has to be made available to the committee so that way they can make a decision on the use of animals to make sure it's appropriate. Also, there has to be some type of education or training for anybody involved in the research of using the animals. Okay, lots of stuff there. So what are some of the federally mandated IACUC functions that the IACUC itself, the Institutional Animal Care and Use Committee, has to be reviewed at least once every 6 months for the humane care and use of animals, that facilities need to be inspected, and also reports have to be made back through the institutional official. What else here? I want to, actually, you all can read this one. I want to get to this next, yeah, this is the one I wanted to get to, the side-by-side comparison. Because the applicability really depends on your facility and the sponsoring agencies at your institution. So for example, the National Science Foundation follows the PHS requirements, which is your DHHS, sorry, your DHHS requirements, while ONR requires compliance with USDA regulations. So at CSU, because we have so much going on in this area, we're actually compliant with both USDA and DHHS. So notice, so before I said, remember the definition of an animal is going to vary by regulatory agency. That's one thing to notice on this slide, is that USDA defines living or deceased mammals, and there are some exclusions there, where DHHS is talking about live vertebrate animals. And if you really dig down into these areas, they even specify that it, you know, might be dogs and cats and primates, but excluding birds. You know, you don't have to know that level of detail for the exam, but your folks on your IRB and in your compliance office better know those levels of detail. So that's why I don't have them listed here, because you won't have to know that. Do know that there are differences in the two, USDA or DHHS, in their definitions. Also, the next thing to note, the differences on the slides, is that the membership of the IACUC varies according to the two agencies. So with, sorry, I left a C off here. I just noticed that. The 3-member IACUC, IACUC, has to have at least, a chairman, a doctor of veterinary medicine, and a non-affiliated, meaning not affiliated with your institution, member. The doctor of veterinary medicine could be an employee of your institution, like there's a he right now. Lon is our vet who is actually an employee of CSU, or they could be a contracted person. Yeah, it's okay, it doesn't get specified there. Conversely, with DHHS, it has to be a 5-member IACUC, and you can read the 5 members there. And then the final differences between the two is that inspections have to happen annually for USDA, where the inspections are for cause, meaning that you either self-reported something or something came up during an annual USDA inspection and they told DHHS to come out and check out your facilities, right? So that inspection is typically for cause, where USDA has to occur on an annual basis. So, okay. Any questions on animal welfare assurance or IACUC committee requirements and the level of detail you'll need to know for the exam? Oh, okay.
I just have a question.
Sorry, Celia. Yep.
On the veterinarian, you mentioned that they can be contracted. Does that mean that this position is normally compensated?
Yes, yes.
And that's okay. It does not create a conflict of interest.
Right, right.
Okay. Is that the only one on the IACUC that can be compensated, or can anyone that serves?
No, I don't know, because I know that sometimes chairmans are compensated. So I think that compensation isn't necessarily, like your university could compensate the chair of your IRB or IRCUC, again, as long as it's not, outside. You know what I mean, like undue influence there. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I've actually heard of some institutions that have paid members of their IACUC and IRB. So you're compensating them for their time in that work. So, okay. Other questions? Okay. Okay, biosafety. Biosafety, we're talking about research involving potentially hazardous biological materials. And the one that we're really concerned with is recombinant DNA. And there also might be some materials that are on the select agent CDC list. So recombinant DNA is, I forgot how Jeff described this, but nasty stuff, right? But basically, when you have DNA molecules from two or more species that are combined together, right? And typically what happens is a DNA molecule is inserted into a host organism to produce a new genetic combination that hopefully is of some value to science. This is how we get vaccines. This is how we get human insulin. This is how we get crops that are resistant to certain pests out there. So a lot of research is being done with recombinant DNA. The issue is we don't want this recombinant DNA to eke out into the public, right? Because it can be really potentially harmful. Some really good benefits on one side, but also could have a lot of harm. So there's a lot of regulation around this. And again, the regulation comes out of growing concerns from the population that there could be potential impacts on our food chain. There could be potential impacts on the environment if organisms who were expressing recombinant DNA were introduced into the environment. So public outcry is typically seemingly always within mandates, determines laws, right? Congressional hearings, laws are formed, and then we have to have these regulatory agencies that help us then implement those laws. So you all have probably heard of the case of Henrietta Lacks, right? That's gotten a lot of attention. There was actually a book and a movie. that was put out within like the last at least 5 years. Back in 1951, there was a scientist that used cells, unique cells from Henrietta Lacks, without her consent to create a cell line that's still being used today. Her family didn't get compensation for the use of these cells. And so there's been a lot of development then of regulatory guidance for rDNA work. Also just kind of regulatory guidance on using any kind of human biological tissues as well. So this is just a definition. I've already gone on that. Didn't realize that was there, but there's the definition for you of what I was just talking about. Okay, and then the regulatory framework. NIH guidelines for research involving recombinant DNA. It's interesting because this regulation is really broad. So if an institution receives any funding for recombinant DNA research, even if it's only for one research project, all the projects then that are conducted at that institution have to comply, whether they're funded, by that agency or not, have to comply with this guidance. So it's very broad. So if you're going to receive one award for this rDNA research, you better make sure all of your rDNA research then falls under this guidance. Okay, so what are the basic regulatory requirements? That the research has to be reviewed by an Institutional Biosafety Committee. Again, it could be called something different at your institution, but you have to have some type of IBC where they have to do a risk-benefit analysis. They also have to make sure they have appropriate physical containment, okay, to make sure, again, these organisms don't get out into the public domain or into the environment. Ensure that the PI is in compliance with the guidelines for training, and that if there are violations, that these are reported to the Office of Biotechnology Activities within 30 days. So the PIs have to be trained, and they're supposed to also in turn train their laboratory staff in supervising and handling these type of agents. Okay. Also, Jeff went through the different BSL levels. The biosafety level 1. I didn't remember those being on the exam, but they're always in the review. And he went through them, so I would be familiar with them. BSL levels 1, 2, 3, and 4. 1 is basically working with any agents that are not known to cause any specific diseases in a healthy human. 2 have more potential hazard for people and the environment. 3, you're looking at microbes that can cause serious and potentially lethal diseases upon inhalation. So you just have to be there and breathe them in, and it can wreak havoc with the system. And then 4 is with agencies that are easily transmitted and can cause fatal diseases in humans, and for which there are no available vaccines or treatments. So really nasty stuff. So different levels of containment and requirements on each. You wouldn't have to know the requirements on each, but you should at least be familiar that 1's kind of your basic level, as opposed to 4, which is like serious containment and training issues. Okay. So requirements for your Institutional Biosafety Committee: no fewer than 5 persons, at least 2 not affiliated. So now we have 2 public members, because there could be more of an impact on the public, right, and on the environment. So 2 folks not affiliated with an institution. And it's really interesting. So Sylvia, I don't know if you come across this with your institution. I did it when I was with institutions that were in smaller communities, small institutions, because everybody's freaking affiliated with the institution. When you live in a community where your institution is the primary employer, it is hard to get members who are not affiliated with the institution. Do you all come across that as well?
Absolutely.
Absolutely, yeah. It's hard. They have children who go there. They were alumni. They're sitting on some kind of board of directors for your institution.
So is there an actual definition of affiliation?
I do not know if non-affiliated. I mean, I know it extends to, family members as well. Let me hunt down I'm sure there's something out there as far as the actual definition. I just don't know it. I'll hunt that down. That would be an interesting did you know tidbit. Okay. You have to have both plant and animal containment experts, also an institutional biosafety officer, and this is only if you're working with rDNA, of having a human gene transfer expert. Somebody who knows what the heck this stuff is about, right? That you have to have somebody reviewing for you. I was again, at my smaller institutions, we weren't doing rDNA research, so this wasn't a concern to us, but it was a concern with the non-affiliated on our IRB and IACUC. Okay, so I also mentioned in addition to our CNA about the select agents on the CDC list. So these select agents and toxins include organisms that cause things like anthrax and smallpox and bubonic plague, right? Those and maybe COVID-19 at some point. So anytime you're using these kind of select agents, to make sure that you're having a review of protocols of the investigators using those select agents. The nice thing is that hopefully your investigator can't obtain these agents, you know, unless they have that proper review, right? That they cannot even order them into your institution unless they've had their protocols approved. You notice how I say hopefully? Hopefully, right? Okay. And then this is just some of the regulatory framework under those different agents. And so I'm not gonna, again, read these to you. So just know that there are some agents out there. The biggest thing is really understanding the Institutional Biosafety Committee makeup for the purposes of the exam. And again, you're not going to have to know. I just gave you this for, you know, if this stuff really interests you and you want to do further reading. So this was just a reference slide. Okay. Basic regulatory requirements are registering with the select agent program and having a responsible official, an RO, with approval, and having annual inspections where these different select agents or toxins are being stored and also being used in the research, and that there should be some type of training. Again, the training isn't prescribed, but that you have to have training that is compliant with the guidance. Okay, and that's really all there is to throw at you on institutional biosafety. Are there questions before we move on to RCR, responsible conduct of research? Okay, we're doing good. We have 30 minutes to get through RCR and COI, which we've already covered COI quite a bit in detail in other slides. So I'm going to hit it high level, and then we're going to end with export controls, if you all are still awake at that point. Okay, responsible conduct of research, RCR. So the interesting thing here is that RCR training is for trainees. So typically it's your students, undergraduate students, graduate students, postdoc. It's really kind of interesting that your investigators don't have to go undergo RCR, where in my opinion, all investigators should have to undergo RCR. And the typical areas of RCR training, we're going to go through. We've already talked about human subjects, animal subjects, biosafety. We're going to go through some of the other areas that we haven't talked about yet that are listed on this slide. So the framework. Framework comes from the America Competes Act of 2007, which was signed into law by President George W. Bush. I think somebody should have gotten an award for creative acronym because the America Competes Act is America creating opportunities by meaningfully promoting excellence in technology, education, and science. America Competes. Somebody had to work really hard at that. And there is a quote here from that framework. And the thing that I wanted you to, and it's in red here, because again, this is for our trainees, our students, our postdocs. The requirements, the federal regulatory requirements as far as the training goes, is for your trainees. So some of the federal awarding agencies such as the ones listed here, have some sort of RCR training requirements depending upon the nature of the award and, again, the participants, the trainees. And they allow the institution to determine the content that's being trained, how it's delivered, whether it's in person or it could be an on-demand module. Some agencies, I think NSF wanted to see both, that it couldn't all be online. Some of it had to be in person, but they didn't say like a majority has to be this or that. Instead, they just said that, you know, it really shouldn't just be all online, that there should be that in-person component as well. Of course, we know through online now we can actually do kind of in-person. So in-person might not be in the classroom. It could be just to make sure that they have an instructor that they can talk with and discuss with, and that can happen in a Zoom feature like this. So the delivery format, the length of the training, the depth of the training is something that institutions get to decide upon. It's not prescribed to us by these federal awarding agencies. But the training is required for trainees. Okay. And again, we've talked about 3 areas that are already included under RCR, human, animal, and biosafety. Some other areas that we haven't talked about are things like research misconduct. So research misconduct is when these trainees or anybody violates standards of scholarly conduct. Whether it's in the proposal, so they've plagiarized information in their proposal, or they provided false data in their proposal. It could be during the performance of the research that they falsified or fabricated some of the research data. In reviewing the research, so if you have somebody who is reviewing the research and they steal somebody else's idea during that review, that would be research misconduct. And then in reporting the results, if anybody's reporting false data, false results, all of that falls under research misconduct. So the types of misconducts out there basically fall under fabrication. You're making stuff up, right? You're fabricating, you're making up the data, falsifying the data. Oh, that data point doesn't look good and is not in line with it, so I'm going to change that data point. Okay. Shouldn't be changing the data point. You might say we have an extraneous data point out there and speculate as to why, but you shouldn't change your data, right? And then just outright plagiarism, where and it's interesting because some agencies now are even, so you know how when students submit papers, their instructors are putting them through certain software to check to see if they're plagiarizing. I have heard that agencies are doing that now, particularly like National Science Foundation, with proposals to see if PIs are plagiarizing, and if so, then they're going to kick that proposal out and cite them with research misconduct. So scary stuff. So the areas under research misconduct, I just went through these: fabrication, falsification, and plagiarism. Making stuff up, manipulating or changing, or conveniently omitting data that wasn't in line with the rest of your research results, or taking somebody else's ideas and not giving them credit. So the basic regulatory requirements: institutions have to develop policies and procedures for handling allegations of misconduct. Institutions should have a RIO, a Research Integrity Officer. So at our institution, if you all didn't know, it's Ellen Fisher, who is an assistant VPR. And then also that we report any allegations of misconduct through an annual report. The other thing here that I should have included here is that we also should have in place protections for whistleblowers. So if you have a graduate student who needs to report something that their investigator or their advisor is doing, that there's no repercussions to them. So we should have in place protections for whistleblowers. Conflict of interest and conflict of a commitment are other areas where that are included under responsible conduct of research training for our trainees. I talked a lot about COI some time ago. I don't remember when. Maybe during proposal review, because we have to make sure that the significant financial interests have been disclosed for some PHS agencies at time of review. So probably back in those slides is when we talked about it. But just to make a distinction here between COI and COC, COI and COC because sometimes I think the distinction, it can be a little fuzzy. So when I think about conflict of commitment, I think about when interests with somebody's employments have some undue influence on their judgment. So if an investigator is serving on a peer review, say of their colleague or their graduate student, right, that's a commitment conflict, and they might have to recuse themselves from that review. Okay, think of it kind of like maybe like a calendar conflict. Okay, I have outside professional activities. If those are somehow making undue influence on my work here at CSU, then I have a conflict of commitment. I think the very first time I ran into conflict of commitment, I was back at Western Kentucky University, and so this was back like in 2000. And our provost went on her lunch hour to the local flea market. And what she encountered was one of our research investigators there with a booth in the middle of the day when that researcher is under contract with the institution to teach and do research and had a booth set up, right, at this flea market. Now, having a little side business or selling your wares at the flea market is not necessarily conflict unless you're doing it on your university time, right? And it's conflicting with the fact that that person should have been there available for students for advising, and even if they weren't teaching class, they still have institutional commitments. So that was when our provost was like, we need some kind of policy on commitment and outside obligations. So that's conflict of commitment. Where conflict of interest, and again, we went through a lot of slides on financial conflict of interest and conflict of interest, so I'm not going to go through these again. But I think the next slide has what I really wanted to remind you all about financial conflict of interest, and it's that it applies to institutions and it applies to the investigator, and not only to the principal investigator, but also to any of the personnel that are responsible for the design, conduct, or reporting of the research. So it's pretty broad. Okay. What are the basic requirements around this? The institution should maintain appropriate written and enforced policies, that we offer some type of COI training, that we have a designated institutional official. Again, ours now is Shannon Pipes. And then there are specific agencies, and remember that PHS list wasn't just like DHHS and NIH. There were even, like Komen Foundation was on that list. There were a number of agencies that apply that PHS regulation, even if they're not typical PHS entities. So there are specific agencies that make sure that even at the proposal stage, that the investigator has reported any significant financial interest. And remember, significant, that definition, that level of what makes it significant, whether it's $5,000 or $10,000, could vary by agency, and it also changes. So that's why Jeff said those type of thresholds aren't going to be on the exam, because they change too often, right? They change more often than they can keep up with making the changes on the exam. So, okay, questions? I know I'm blowing through materials. Questions on COI or COC? Okay, I still see people logged in, so I guess we're good to go. Let's move on then to export controls. Okay, export controls. Hey, what are we talking about here? Export controls are actually the laws and regulations. Okay, laws and regulations that regulate, restrict the release of critical technologies. Again, not going to read it to you, but the important thing on this slide is you know that the controls are the regulations that we're talking about. So what is an export? An export is when you transmit, or when somebody transmits certain select items, certain technologies, services, or data outside of the US. That could be physically taking something with us in a briefcase. It could be submitting something through a facsimile. Do we even have faxes anymore? Through an email. Or it could be what's called a deemed export, where you're releasing that information to a non-US person. So you don't have to even go anywhere. I think sometimes when we think about export, we think of like physically taking stuff out of the United States. It could just be in our communications, right here sitting in our laboratories, right here talking on the telephone with somebody. So it's beyond just actually physically taking items or sending items. It's releasing that technology even in, talking with each other. So it could be software source code. It could be technical data. Who knows? So one of the first meetings I was ever invited to when I first became a trainer at CSU, we went to meet some folks in the engineering department. I'm pretty sure it was engineering. It was so long ago. Anyway, actually, was it engineering? I think it was engineering. That doesn't matter. What matters is there was at least one younger, very enthusiastic research scientist there who was so enthusiastic because some software they were developing, folks in China were interested in, to the point that folks in China had paid them to go to China and talk about this. And he said, in the course of the conversation with us, he said, I've been working on this software for over a year with my graduate students. This company could take this source code and run with it and do like amazing things in no time at all because they have this great big company and great big business and multi-million dollars, and he was all excited about this. And he had shared his information with them. I was like, you just said this company could take and run with and do in months what it's taken you a year to do, and you shared this information. So my question to him was, did you have a non-disclosure agreement with them? And they were like crickets chirping in the room. No, never thought about that. He was just excited because he thought he was going to get some money and that they had flown him to China and they were going to fly him to China again. A problem, right? That's a problem. What was in that code could have been a problem from an export control issue. The other problem is not having a non-disclosure, that company could have basically taken that code and done whatever they wanted with it, and then that investigator would have been out. So several different issues there. Okay, so examples of items that are subject to export controls. Again, not going to read them to you, but when you read this export control list, I at least found it really interesting of some of the items that are on this list, such as endangered species and oscilloscope. Like, I didn't even know they still had oscilloscopes. That's something I used as a graduate student, but because of the technology in that oscilloscope is what they're concerned with, about not taking that technology to another country. A glass centrifuge. It's like, really? Again, there must be something in the technology there. GPS terminology, that's on your cell phones, right? That could be an export controlled item depending upon the country that you're going to. And telecommunication software is something we're going to see more and more, particularly as we're looking more into foreign influence, which I don't want to confuse with the whole export control issue. But just know that there are quite a number of items on the list. You do not have to know all of these items for the exam. You should know that a list exists, okay? And that hopefully you have somebody at your institution that's comparing research being done and items being shared with these export control lists, okay? What you will have to know for the purpose of the exam are the 3 export control agencies: Department of Commerce, Department of State, and Department of Treasury. Okay, Department of Commerce deals with commercial goods that could also have military applications. So the dual use material. So dual use material is an item with potential military use. So Commerce keeps this commerce control list, and it has a list of all of these different types of dual use materials, also concerned with the deemed exports, what I just mentioned, where you're not physically taking something out, but you're releasing certain technologies and information to a non-US person. Okay, so Department of Commerce has the Export Administration Regulations, EAR. Link the information together. Commerce with EAR, which is your dual use and deemed exports. Okay, then you have your Department of State, and the thing in red here is what you need to link to Department of State, your International Traffic in Arms Regulations, or ITAR. Okay, so here they're concerned with military articles, military services. So if you think of Department of State and Department of Defense, it's all the military stuff. Traffic and arms regulations, they keep the munitions list and keep all of those things on the list that we don't want to be taking to certain other countries. Okay, and then finally you have your Department of Treasury. and under the Department of Treasury is the Office of Foreign Assets Control. They are concerned with your trade sanctions, with any embargoes that we have. Think about money, right? Treasury is money, so embargoes and trade sanctions that we have with other countries. So in embargoes, when we have those financial restrictions on, on financial transactions with other countries. So making sure that it's not an embargo country. And again, that's something that your export control officer can consult those lists to know who currently we have trade sanctions with or embargoes with. Okay. Currently, countries like Iran, North Korea, Syria, Cuba was on, was off. I think they're back on now. Again, that list will change, so you need to have somebody at your institution that knows who's currently on that list. Okay, so, and what can be, if you can even travel to that country, and if you can, what kind of things you can take or not take with you, or even engage in certain research, particularly if it's going to be a financial advantage to them. So this is just one that, unless like you're really savvy with export controls, you're just going to have to memorize, right? Commerce, again, deals with those deemed exports, dual-use materials. State is defense, so anything military. And then your Treasury is going to deal with your economic and trade sanctions. So for me, this was just a pure flashcard memorization. And there was actually a really good webinar that was done from like what you need to know as a research administrator on export controls, and I'm happy to share that with folks if you didn't get a chance to see it. Okay. Oops, is that there? There's the regulatory framework. I provided that just for contextual information if you need to go read and learn more. One thing that we talked about when we talked about negotiating contracts was the fundamental research exclusion and not taking restrictions on publications. And I said we get to why. Here's why. Okay, fundamental research exclusion. Okay, written here, when technology or software arises during fundamental research and is intended to be put out in the public domain, is not subject to the Export Administration regulations. Generally, this technology is not subject to Export Administration regulations. As soon as we accept a public restriction, all of a sudden now, this type of information is subject to the Export Administration regulations, which is why, as an institution, we don't like to accept public restrictions. So typically, that information that's out there in the public domain, it's meant to be published, it's meant to be shared through a peer-reviewed journal, through our libraries, through public conferences and presentations, even through patents and trademarks. It's out there in the public domain. As soon as we say, okay, we're not going to allow technology transfer around this, we're not going to allow publication, or publications have to be approved, all of a sudden we've taken away that exclusion, and that could be a problem. So now, I said generally technology and software that arises from these things is not subject to EAR. I've had folks who, so I have a friend who's at Auburn in Alabama, right? And he said that they basically, in their engineering department, some students got in trouble because they had some information on a website out in public domain that the feds thought should have been protected information, and they stepped in and told them to take it off. And it was basically the students had come up with some schematics for a satellite and shared that information as a class project on a website. Typically we would think, oh, this is, kind of fundamental research, it's out in the public domain, but they actually had the feds show up at their door and say, take that information off. So kind of generally, if in doubt, you should check with your export control officer. Hopefully you have one, or whoever is in charge of export controls at your institution. But again, getting back to the purpose of the exam, just know that whenever you accept any kind of contract clause that's going to restrict that public domain, whether it's being able to publish or patent, then you have just taken away that fundamental research exclusion, which can be a problem. Okay, exceptions to the fundamental research exclusion. Okay, public domain except when, and then here are some of the exceptions. Okay, So again, not going to read these to you. So we don't want to be getting into situations where sponsor approval is required to publish or publication results are restricted. It's kind of the bottom line there. Okay. Or in the case of not allowing certain students because of their background to be involved in research. So like no foreign persons on our research, that can be problematic for institutions as well. Okay, what else? The rest is just reference material, which then brings us to our questions, which should be on here. So lots of reference material on here, just for you to peruse at your leisure. Sorry, I should have taken those out of my slide deck, but you have them, that's the important thing. Well, just know, actually don't even worry about homework for this week, but know coming up, so October is the heavy time, right? Because we are ending end of October, so we have 3 more sessions together. We are going to be talking award administration, cost principles, and post-award. So we're going to get into those 3 areas in our next 3 weeks. And remember, are we already at the window closed, or is the window coming up closed for registering for the exam? I think it's coming right up. So know if you wanted to take the exam this fall that your window of opportunity is slamming shut. So, but there will always be next spring if you don't feel like you're ready yet. Okay, so chime in on chat. Which of the following principles are addressed in the Belmont? Oh, okay, I didn't. I thought I changed these. Huh. Somebody chime in. Is this the same question that you have on your slides? Yes, okay. I thought I went through and changed all these so there weren't all or none of the above. Huh. I either missed them or I did not change them on my slides. But anyway, let's just go through. Just remember in the exam, they're not going to ask you all or none of the above kind of questions. And they're not going to ask you like, it's only B and C or A and B. So, okay, so, but which of these is addressed in the Belmont report? And you're right, it's A, respect for persons is under Belmont report. Okay, principle of community is actually CSU. Okay. Which of the following are considered protected populations as research subjects? Children, elderly, college students, or research administrators? Anybody know here? Okay. Are these A's from the last time or are these new A's? We'll say the A's are for this time and it's actually children. Okay, they're a protected research population as are prisoners. Okay, college students, no. Research administrators, no, of course not. We are not a protected population. Which of the following refers to the common rule? A, B, C, or D? Okay, and I see new A's coming up. Thank you, Becky and Corinne and Carmen. So yes, A, 45 CFR 46. How often must an IACUC review its institution's programs and inspect the animal facilities? Lots of A's again. Apparently I was very A happy when I wrote these questions. So every 6 months. Okay. Okay. According to USDA, how many members must be on an IACUC? 3, 4, 5, or USDA does not set a required number. Okay. And remember, there's some differences here depending upon the organization, right? If it's FDA or USDA. And so for this one, it's A again. You thought A simply couldn't be the answer again, but guess what? It is. It's A, 3. Okay. According to DHHS, guidance on the use of animals in research applies to all animals, living and deceased animals, living vertebrates used or intended for use in research, only mice, rats, and livestock. Do y'all remember? I got some C's there. Yep, C. Okay. Which of the following is true regarding use of recombinant DNA? Institutional Biosafety Committee must have 1 member not affiliated with the institution. NIH guidance applies only to NIH-sponsored research. The makeup of the committee is prescribed by federal regulation, or R&DA is not regulated. And I see some C's. The answer is C, right? There should be 2 people not affiliated with the institution. That's why A was not correct. And then NIH guidance. If you take one NIH research, all of your research then has to fall under this guidance, which is true of FCOI regulation. Only the PI are subject. Significant financial interests, and that would not be a question on the exam. So I'm going to give you the answer on that one, because remember Jeff said the amounts wouldn't be on there. Okay, under America Competes, who must receive training on responsible conduct of research? PI, all senior personnel, undergraduates, graduates, and postdocs, or research administrators, right? See, trainees, it's basically trainees. Okay. Dr. Simmons tweaked her data in order to achieve publishable findings. Dr. Simmons committed which type of research misconduct? B, right? Falsify. Fabrication is making it up. Just, I'm just going to make the falsification is, as I say, fudging the numbers. Or data tweaking, same thing. Okay, which of the following agencies oversees dual use materials? Commerce, Treasury, State, or Department of Foreign Assets? Sylvia is right on it. Commerce. And that's it. And we have a minute to spare. Whoa! So, okay, thanks for hanging in. I know that this is just, wow, a lot of heavy memorization stuff if you don't deal with this area a lot. And it's not a best practice of what you should know as a research administrator. It's just what you need to know for the exam. So next week we will do award administration, and you don't have homework. Yay! And I will send out the slides here within the next day or 2. So thanks so much for being here.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Have a good day.
Okay, you too.
Thanks.
Tricia,
Yes.
I have a question.
Yes.
It's got to do with